We are about to speed through 20 quotations which will guarantee you top grades. Some students will ask me, are these the only 20 quotations I need to revise, sir? And the answer is probably, because all exam boards are happy to accept references as well as quotations. We're going to dive in with Burling because Burling summons the inspector. The quotation that proves this is the one where he says, "Community and all that nonsense. A man has to mind his own business and his own, but he never gets to finish because the bell goes announcing the arrival of the inspector. His anti-community message has summoned this potentially supernatural being, Inspector Ghoul, and that being's job is to correct that worldview. He is not just attacking the idea of business and capitalism. This isn't just an anti-capitalist play. It's much more than that. He's attacking this idea of the rejection of community, the rejection of socialism. And that's why this quotation is so important in establishing Priestley's purpose. The next most important thing that Burling says is his disbelief that war is coming. This is why Priestley sets the play in 1912, and this is why he references Germans, because we had the Second World War just as he is publishing this play. He says the Germans don't want war. Now that's a much better quotation than the Titanic one for discrediting his view. After all, the Titanic killed a couple of thousand people, I imagine. I haven't checked. Whereas the Second World War, call it 8 million. The war quotation is much more important and it links more to Priestley's purpose. Priestley founded the campaign for nuclear disarmament. He is an anti-war writer. But even more importantly, he's making the case that capitalism needs war. That's how the capitalist system works. It needs to build demand to get people buying. Well, in Burling's day, how do they do it? War, baby, war! Kill people, destroy stuff, and then make more stuff to replace what's been destroyed. Money, 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 money. Priestley makes this distinction very clear, but ironically, because Burling says there's everything to lose and nothing to gain by war. Now, Priestley's audience knew that was complete rubbish because it was a national scandal at the time how many British businessmen had made an absolute fortune out of the First World War. And that was one of the reasons that the socialist government got elected in 1945, because they didn't want a repeat of that greed. So Priestley is pointing out Burling's stupidity, almost pointing out that he's lucky to have such a successful business because he doesn't understand how business and capitalism works. Our next quotation is, of course, unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. But we're not using that just to discredit Burling's views. We're now thinking of it as a symbol. In 1945, what was unsinkable as a metaphor? What was impossible? Getting rid of the greatest wartime leader we'd ever had, Winston Churchill, a national hero. How on earth could Priestley expect a Labour Party to gain victory over such an amazing man, leading a party that had saved the country from invasion and conquest and Nazism and blah-de-blah? My God, how could you do it? Well, part of the socialist message is that things are not inevitable. Change for the better is possible. The Titanic that appeared unsinkable was then completely sunk. In the same way, the political powers that existed before the war that appear so powerful they can't be changed or altered, they too can be sunk. And of course, in the 1945 elections, just after this play was first performed, they were. One of the massive questions Priestley and his audience are asking is, look, the First World War was actually called the war to end all wars. People believed that there would never be another world war like it because the price was so high, the catastrophe was so great. And yet, 21 years later, in 1939, the whole world is suddenly at war again. And so Priestley's saying, how could we go from belief A to fact B? From certainty we could never have such a catastrophic war to another, even more catastrophic war. How is this possible? And his play tries to explain that. He's not saying it's the fault of politicians. He's not saying it's the fault of Hitler. He's not saying it's the fault of fascism and international relations. He's saying this. It is the fault of arrogant businessmen like Berling. It's the fault of the ruling classes who sacrificed their sons' lives in the First World War and then did not learn the lesson of that sacrifice. They ignored that sacrifice and allowed the conditions of war to permeate through the 2 decades after 1920. So those in authority did not learn the lesson of the First World War, which is why Berling doesn't learn the lesson of Eva's death. And that's why he says, now look at them, the famous younger generation who know it all, and they can't even take a joke. Priestley is making a parallel between the death of this one person, Eva, and all those deaths suffered in the First World War. One represents the whole. And that's why the second phone call at the end of the play is going to represent the Second World War. That second death happens because the Berlings refused to learn the inspector's lesson, just as that generation in 1912 didn't learn the lesson of the catastrophe of 1914 to 18, so history was able to repeat itself. So Berling exists as a warning about what has gone wrong in society. The inspector enters and he is Priestley's proxy, represents Priestley's political and social views. We've already established that Priestley gives him great power because he is summoned almost supernaturally by Berling's words, dismissing community. One of the most important things the inspector says is that we should put ourselves in the place of these young women counting their pennies in their dingy little back bedrooms. Firstly, this is telling us that he believes in community. We need to put ourselves into other people's shoes. That's what community is. However, he has picked on women. Why is Priestley so obsessed with women? Sheila is the person who's going to carry the inspector's views and therefore Priestley's views. The victim is Eva. The last person to cause Eva's tragedy is Sybil Berling. This is a play obsessed with the role of women. Why? Because Priestley's saying the biggest injustice in society is the way women are treated. But also, the people with the greatest power to change society are women. Because in 1912, no woman had the vote. But in 1945, every single woman has the vote. And all those women can remember what happened to their mothers and grandmothers in the First World War. In particular, they'll remember the million women who became employed during the First World War and then were immediately sacked when the men returned from war. In the Second World War, it was going to be different. The women were not going to be sacked. The women had a vote, and the women's vote was able to change the course of history. In the inspector's final words before he disappears at the end of Act 2, he's very clear that Eva is a symbolic figure. He talks about the millions and millions of John Smiths and Eva Smiths. In other words, she represents the whole of the working class. Now, the reason that's important is the audience, of course, would have been filled with middle-class educated people, the very people who need to change their attitude to the working classes or the poor. But he also uses this to emphasise community. He says, "We are not alone. We are members of one body." Now, this language is crucial to Priestley. 80% or more of his audience is Christian, going to church every Sunday. We are members of one body is language that comes directly from the Holy Communion, when you eat the body of Christ and drink Christ's blood, not literally unless you believe in transubstantiation and you're a Catholic, blah, blah, blah. However, symbolically, this is effectively asking, what would Jesus do? What would a Christian do? A Christian would have to believe in community. A Christian would have to believe in doing good to your fellow man. And therefore, Priestley's point is, therefore, a Christian would have to vote for a socialist society. They couldn't in all conscience vote for a capitalist society because that does not care for people collectively. It only cares about individuals. That's a very persuasive argument to an audience that is very likely to be made up of conservative voters. He can't change their mind with a play, but he can say, look, you already have this Christian belief which ought to change your mind for you. Then we have the inspector's final warning. If men will not learn that lesson, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Now, many readers just see this as a reference to industrial unrest, but really, fire and blood? I don't think so. This is a reference to the First World War coming in 1914 and the Second World War coming in 1939. He's making a direct link between capitalism and self-interest and exploitation of the workers and the impulse to go to war. And effectively, he's saying to the audience, look, you didn't learn the lesson properly in 1918 when the First World War ended. You damn well ought to learn it now in 1945 after the Second World War, because, by the way, the next one is going to be nuclear and you're all dead. Now, crucially, he leaves the stage at this point and there's another act to go. We've got Act 3 to go. Why? Because it's a test. The inspector is testing to see whether the Burlings will learn their lesson in the same way that Priestley is testing the audience to see whether they will learn their lesson. Linking that to the religious context, it's like the test God set up for Adam and Eve. He said, ooh, Garden of Eden, God. He sets up this test for Adam and Eve, don't eat the fruit of the tree. Oh, of course we won't eat the fruit of the tree. Slithery snake comes along and says, eat the fruit of the tree. They eat the fruit of the tree. Calamity! They're expelled from Eden forever. They don't learn their lesson. And so that's the kind of challenge that Priestley is offering his audience. Are you going to create the new Edenic state, the socialist welfare state where everybody looks after everyone else? Or are you going to head into Third World War? Now we move on to Sheila, because Sheila is the inspector's proxy, and the inspector is Priestley's proxy, and therefore what Sheila says is what Priestley believes. So the inspector says about Sheila, in fact, in a strange way, you might have been said to be jealous of her. What's he talking about? The moment when Sheila decided to get Eva sacked because she looked better with this dress that Sheila wanted to buy. Priestley's pointing out that it's very odd someone with all Sheila's social and financial advantages should find it within herself to be jealous of a mere shopkeeper who's socially at the bottom of the scale and obviously financially at the bottom of the scale. Well, Sheila can only be jealous of someone with such low life prospects if society values appearance so highly. And society has damaged women not only by limiting their choices and forcing them to marry to gain any kind of independence, although that itself is not that great an independence. He's also saying that society educates women to value the wrong stuff. They're being forced to value appearances because that's part of their marketable commodity in attracting a suitable male. So what Priestley is pointing out here is not just that women are oppressed in terms of opportunity, they're also so oppressed that their ways of thinking have been damaged. This is a subtle way to address the women in the audience and say, look, you are just being given male values here, and when you talk about fashion, when you talk about makeup, when you talk about beauty and appearance, all you're really doing is conforming to what men want from you. Is that the future you want? And he takes Sheila and tries to take that away from her so that she can see herself in a totally different light. Sheila also brings home to us the difference between her perspective and her mother's. There is no reason in terms of the action of the plot to create Alderman McGarty, but he's there because he is abusive to women. Sheila remarks that a friend of hers went to see him and she only escaped with the torn blouse. Well, two things here. First, that word only suggests that she was lucky just to escape with a torn blouse, and actually the abuse could have been much greater. But secondly, this is common knowledge. Everybody knows that this is the way Alderman McGarty behaves, and society has done absolutely nothing. In fact, Sybil Burling wants to shut it up. She says, don't talk like that. She would rather hide the truth than change it. So Sheila now becomes a symbol for the younger generation in the audience in 1945. Priestley's asking them to identify with her. And when we see the struggles between Sheila and Eric and their parents, that is a symbol for the struggles of the younger generation in the audience with their own parents' generation who have controlled the levers of power, led the country to war, and ensured that society is not equal. Now, once Gerald has exposed the inspector as a fake, the rest of the family are hugely relieved. He comes up with this theory that it might not have been one single girl, the inspector might have used several different photographs, and Sheila points out, all right, but it doesn't make any real difference, you know. Her point is, our actions are what matter, whereas the Burlings are not interested in their actions, they're only interested in their reputation. Whereas Sheila is saying, no, that's not how we run a successful society. It's our actions we're responsible for because we're all of one body. The final quotation for Sheila is also the final quotation for the play, so you're going to have to wait till the end of the video for that one. We now move on to Eric. Eric is the most complex character in the play because he embodies the inspector's views, he learns the inspector's lesson, but Priestley's got a problem. Society didn't learn the lesson of the First World War. So he can't end the play with Eric having completely learned the lessons because that would imply there would be no Second World War and therefore symbolically there wouldn't be that second telephone call saying there's another body in the infirmary. So he has to create a complex character here who learns the right lessons but fails to act on them, just like that generation did between the wars. We first find that Eric has learnt the socialist message when he says, why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for higher prices. This is Priestley looking at the economics of his day. Eric is saying that system is completely unfair, because that's also what Priestley believes. But now we come to the complexity. Eric has got Eva pregnant, but we find out that this has happened in a potentially violent way. He claims not to remember what happened. He claims that he was too drunk to remember, but of course this might simply be an avoidance of facing up to his own responsibility for his actions. He does say, well, I was in a state where a chap easily turns nasty. I threatened to make a row. This is a euphemism. Regardless of what has actually happened, this is clearly against Eva's wishes. It's clearly an abusive relationship, and yet she feels she needs to stay with him because that is her only route to any kind of financial security. Priestley focuses on Eric in this way to make it absolutely clear that Eva's position is not her own fault. It's the fault of the men around her. It's Gerald who has taken advantage of her, as we shall see, and now it's Eric who has found her at an even lower ebb and taken even more advantage of her and behaved even more cruelly and with more exploitation. Now, we can add into Eric's favour that he offers to marry her and she turns him down because she says He doesn't love her. But I'm going to dismiss that because Eric has no prospects to marry her. He has no money, as we discover with his stealing from the family business. Which brings us to the next point about Eric. He steals £50 from the family business, but he doesn't confess to stealing it. He only confesses to taking it. He justifies it by saying, no, it's not really stealing. I intended to pay it back. Now, this gets to the root of Eric's problem. He is deceiving himself. It implies to us that though learning the lesson now in the moments of the play is genuine, he is in fact still drunk. We know he's an alcoholic who's been drinking all night. And we also know from this that he's prone to self-justification and self-deception. So it's going to be a very easy step for him in a week, a month, a few years' time to forget the inspector's lesson. But he is also a symbol of capitalism. After all, Eric's generation is the generation that will inherit these businesses after the First World War. Exploiting others for money is not seen as theft in the capitalist system. Priestley doesn't leave Eric like that. He also wants to establish Eric's fundamental good nature, or at least his political ideals. Eric therefore agrees with Sheila. It's the same rotten story whether we told it to a real police inspector or somebody else. By characterising it as a story, essentially a plot, Priestley is saying, look, this is a story which is getting repeated endlessly. It's not just happening in the 2 hours traffic of our stage. It's not just a theatrical performance. When you get home, when you go to work tomorrow, that story is being repeated again and again across society. The rich are exploiting the poor. Businesses are exploiting the workers. You can change this. Vote for a change of government. Now we come to Sybil Burling. Many people assume she is the worst character in the play because she's the final one who has the opportunity to save Eva and doesn't. So the first quotation about Sybil Burling, I hope, will help you see her slightly differently. When Sheila is complaining that Gerald spent part of the summer avoiding her, and we, the audience, come to understand that's because he was having an affair, Mrs. Burling does not defend her daughter. Instead, she defends Gerald. She says, when you're married, you will realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to it just as I had to. So Priestley is saying here that women of Mrs. Burling's generation had to turn a blind eye to their husbands' infidelities. If they thought about it for a moment, they would know that their husbands were not in business and were having affairs. We can also infer that from the word had. Burling is still a very important man of business, but he's no longer working these ridiculous hours. Why not? Because he's a man in his 50s who's no longer out having affairs with young women. And so we know that she knows he was having affairs and she simply had to put up with it because that's the way society oppresses women. It's a transactional cost. In order to retain your social status, you have to marry a man of high status, but in order to keep that status, you have to allow him to do things that are actually unacceptable in a moral society. So at the beginning of the play, we have some sympathy for Mrs. Burling because society has put her in this position. We then have less sympathy because she's telling her own daughter that this is the way of the world and you're just going to have to accept it. But that's another reason why Priestley sets the play in 1912, because he's saying to his 1945 audience, yes, that's the way it was for your mothers and your grandmothers, but let's change the future for you. The next quotation about Mrs. Burling is where she has absolutely no empathy for Eva's predicament. So she won't accept any responsibility, and she actually begins to say, girls of that class. as though a superior figure like Sybil could ever empathise and understand an inferior, potentially subhuman figure like Eva. Priestley is pointing out the true evils of the class society, which stop everybody seeing each other not just as one body, but even fully human. The class system is clearly the enemy here, not just capitalism. Burling represents the pernicious effects of capitalism, but Sybil Burling represents the added pernicious effects of the class system. When Mrs. Burling finally finds out that Eric is responsible for Eva's pregnancy, she says, "I can't believe it," but then she immediately says, "I won't believe it." Now this is crucial because it points again to the way society refused to learn the lessons of the First World War. Priestley is arguing that it's human nature to try to hide painful truths from ourselves, just as it's human nature for us to look after our own interests. But in order to create a better society, we need to become better human beings, and at least for the distance of the act of the play, Sheila and Eric do become better human beings who believe in the inspector's message that we are all of one body. Now we come to Gerald. Those of you who've watched my Gerald video will know that I think he is the worst character in the play, the one who's most exploitative of Eva. My evidence for this is how he got hold of the flat in the first place. He says, "It happened that a friend of mine..." Now, it didn't just happen. This was a very careful arrangement. The friend gave him keys to his flat. Gerald doesn't need anywhere to stay, does he? But he does need somewhere private to take women. Gerald describes this flat as a nice little set of rooms. A description that invites us to imagine what he thinks is nice about it. It's the opportunity it gives him for infidelity. This colours our perspective of this chance encounter in the palace bar. This is a planned encounter because that's where women of the town go. He chooses Eva because she is young and beautiful, but also because she's vulnerable. We know that he is completely cynical because as soon as the 6 months is up, and knowing that Eva is in love with him, he still chucks her out. He doesn't even dip into his pocket and say, "Well, you've been my mistress for 6 months, why don't I now rent an apartment and keep this arrangement going?" He saved all this cash, he gives a little bit to her, and then he says, "Ta-ra, see you later," or maybe not, "I will never see you again." Now, Priestley does this because he's coming back to this idea of willful self-delusion. We've seen it in Eric with the stealing and claiming that he can't remember anything about how Eva first got pregnant. And we've seen it in Sybil Burling saying that she's refusing to believe anything about Eric, that she can't understand girls of a lower class. And so the only hope for the younger generation is Sheila. Does Sheila learn the lesson? Well, we get to almost the end of the play, and Gerald says, "Now about this ring." Priestley makes it clear that Gerald has learned nothing other than, "I've got away with it." Gerald, remember, represents male power in this play. He is Burling's social superior, and he is going to inherit Crofts Limited, which is a bigger firm than Burling's. So we can see that Gerald is completely morally corrupt. And what does Sheila do? She says, "No, not yet. It's too soon. I must think." Now this is a catastrophe, isn't it? This is Priestley saying, she's learnt the lesson of the inspector. She says no. But then she's looking at the patriarchal society and thinking, well, where does that leave me? You are the most valuable male member of my society. You want to marry me. Am I really going to turn all that down? I've got to think. And this introduces the possibility that even Sheila is not going to learn the lesson. Or If she does learn the lesson, she is powerless to affect society because society is patriarchal and she's only a woman. She doesn't even have the vote in 1912. And this is Priestley's way of saying, look, you female members of the audience are not in the same position that Sheila was in. You have power and agency. You can change society. You can make a difference. You can choose your own husband and not have to worry that if you don't, you won't be able to make a living and achieve any independence on your own. And so, an even greater tragedy at the end of the play is probably Sheila's position, where she most learns the inspector's lesson, but is powerless to make a difference. So grade 9 on every character. If you would like to get to grade 9 on every theme, check out the video coming up next.